Hi everyone, and also a huge thank you from my side for the organizers for having me. You already heard from my colleague Carrie Axton yesterday on where we stand in terms of well-being policy application. So my talk will take it back to measurement, and I'll share a little bit of what we have learned from benchmarking well-being country performance at the OECD over the past decade. So when I say measurement here, I'm talking about outcome monitoring at the population level, so not cost-benefit analysis, etc., like the previous speakers. I'll tell you a little bit about the OECD Wellbeing Framework in terms of where it came from and what its key principles are. And then I will relate it back to national well-being initiatives around the OECD. Some of those slides will be a repetition from what you've seen yesterday, but repetition is good for memory. And then I will very practically take our well-being data set that we have at the OECD to show you what some of the findings look like when we're asking the question whether life is getting better in OECD countries and for whom. And then I'll end it with some reflections on some of the challenges we're still facing in well-being monitoring. So the OECD has been working on well-being for more than a decade now. We've done that by, on the one hand, working with national data producers to really encourage them and support them to start collecting well-being measures in official statistics, including on previously unusual, or at that time considered unusual topics such as subjective well-being or trust, to really broaden the evidence base that is available for monitoring well-being. We're doing also the bread and butter of the OECD, which is compare country performance in well-being, and we've supported many member countries over the past years that have developed their own well-being initiatives. Increasingly, we're now going beyond measurement to see how this evidence can really go from being another report to actually inform government decision-making, and we've heard about that yesterday. We're also doing actually well-being modeling and shadow prices, which relates a little bit to what the previous speaker said. I will not speak about this here, but I'm super happy to exchange with you after. And just to say that all well-being activities at the OECD are, since 2020, housed in the OECD WISE Center. So what do we mean with well-being? I think this is a very important question to actually clarify anytime we have a conversation about this topic, because it can mean very different things to the different stakeholder communities depending on who you're talking to. So, and I think we saw this even over the last 2 days, right? Sometimes people refer to, with well-being to just happiness or life satisfaction, and many times we actually meant something more broad in a multidimensional way. So let me clarify what I mean when I'm talking about well-being, and the answer is embodied in the OECD Wellbeing Framework shown on this slide that we are using to answer the question of whether life is getting better for people, the planet, and future generations. So this is an outcomes monitoring framework for measuring progress at the population level, and we operationalize it with a dashboard. So we can talk about the pros and cons of dashboards. We are using a dashboard approach of over 80 indicators that tackle 3 main components. The first, which is the top of this infographic, is well-being outcomes today. So what are really the key ingredients of what make a good life? So we have 11 dimensions of current well-being, which include material conditions, quality of life aspects, and also relational aspects. So with whom and how do we spend our time, and how are we connected to each other and to the public institutions that serve us? So here we focus very strictly in terms of indicator selection on final outcomes that matter to people's lives and include both objective and subjective aspects. So to give you an example, in the area of health, we might have an objective indicator of life satisfaction, but also a subjective one in terms of self-reported health, because we do believe that self-reported measures, while they have some drawbacks, also really show how people themselves feel and have been shown to predict behavior in many ways. The second aspect that's really important in this framework is that we look not only at averages, but at well-being inequalities in all of these dimensions that I just mentioned. So these include inequalities between groups, between top and bottom performers and also deprivations and outcomes. And then lastly, at the bottom of this framework, we have sustainability of well-being, or the systemic resources and risk and resilience factors that guarantee well-being is sustained over time. And measuring current well-being and resources for future well-being separately is really important to get at this question of intertemporal trade-offs. And we often use this metaphor of a car. I think it's actually not our metaphor, but I forgot where it originated from. But basically, when you're driving a car, you have to look at both how fast you're going, but also of how much fuel you have left in the tank. And both of these are really important to look at together. So where did this framework come from? It was developed originally in 2011, so more than 10 years now, under the guidance of the OECD Committee on Statistics and Statistical Policy. So those are national statistical offices coming together at the OECD. It was a very direct response to the landmark Stiglitz and Fitoussi Commission on Measurement of Economic Performance and Social Progress, initiated by the French government at the time. And right now, it feels like we have a lot of momentum again on well-being, which is really exciting. But at the time of this framework, it also really felt like that. So we built on a lot of momentum in our member countries and at European and global levels. Several OECD countries, such as Australia and the UK, had included measures of progress or just launched them at the time. There were calls by the G20 to develop better measures to take into account social and environmental dimensions of economic development, and they were, of course, the UN Rio +20 outcome documents that then informed the SDGs. The components on resources for future well-being were added to our framework a little bit later in 2013 and were informed by an interagency task force on measuring sustainable development. We should say that the framework really hasn't changed much over time in terms of its key components, but we do very regularly update it to, in particular, the dashboard with its indicators to keep track of advances in well-being measurement and also better data availability as we go along in the different journeys in our member countries. And we had a very last major review in 2019. So this is one of the slides you've seen yesterday. There's been a lot of movement in member countries to also develop national well-being frameworks, particularly in the last few years. And today, more than 70% of OECD countries have developed a national framework or a development plan or a survey with a well-being focus. And I specifically want to highlight all the initiatives in green, shaded in green, because those are the ones that have been also accompanied by public consultation. So where people and citizens themselves were asked what really matters to you, what is a good life. And another slide you've already seen, so I won't go in a lot of detail, but the main takeaway here is when we map all those initiatives against each other, we see that they do have a lot in common and there's a lot of overlap in terms of concepts and even at the indicator level. And particularly if you take into account that I just told you several of them have been informed by public consultations, we can say that there's at least international consensus or emerging international consensus on the key ingredients, on the main components of well-being. Another way to compare different international well-being frameworks is to see how and whether they are fitting into those three main themes of well-being today, inclusion or inequality, and resources for future well-being or sustainability. We see here a mapping done by the WISE Horizons project. It's actually not related to the WISE Center, but it's a consortium of universities, and I think we'll hear from Rutger, who's leading this consortium later today. And those are also not only OECD member country initiatives, but they've taken like a broader look. But we can very clearly see that many of those initiatives, well-being initiatives they have looked at, consider at least two of those three components, and there's quite many that also are in the middle. So again, emerging international consensus on what is really important to measure in well-being dashboards. So how does all of this look like in practice, and what are some of the insights we arrive at when looking at the data itself? So at the OECD, we build a data set that contains our dashboard of well-being indicators for all of our member countries, and that now goes back all the way to 2004. This is publicly available for researchers and public servants, and we are also using this to fuel all of our internal well-being analytics. So not only by the WISE Center, but also for other OECD departments that are increasingly using this evidence in their work as well. We are using this data set in particular to publish a regular analytical report on well-being in OECD countries. That's called House Life. The next edition will come out in 2024, so stay tuned for that one. And if we now look at the data and some examples, and I will also speak about communication of well-being, and the importance of data of this. So this is one intro into that. If we look at our host country, Iceland, and ask how does current well-being look like, and how does it compare to other OECD countries? This data, by the way, is from 2019. This is pre-pandemic. We're just updating the figures, but some other numbers that I'll show you a couple of slides down are post-pandemic and more current. So this is more for illustrative purposes. So I mentioned that we have more than 80 indicators. This would be extremely difficult to summarize on one slide. This is communication lesson 1 when you're using a dashboard approach. So we're relying on a smaller set of headline indicators, 2 to 3 for each of those dimensions of current well-being. The longer the bar, the better the performance of Iceland compared to other OECD countries. And we see that Iceland is, perhaps not surprisingly, doing comparatively well in most aspects of current well-being. The areas where the bar is shorter, for example, the gender wage gap, under work and job quality, and the gender gap in feeling safe when walking alone at night, under the safety dimension, actually relate to some of the policy priorities we've heard about from the Prime Minister yesterday. We also actually see a lot of white empty spaces for Iceland in particular, which means there is no internationally comparable data available for some dimensions. So that's also something to think about in terms of data development priorities for international benchmarking. When it comes to sustainability, we are looking at both comparative performance. So in those numbers you see here, a 1 would mean Iceland is in the top third of OECD countries. A 3 would mean it ranks in the bottom third of OECD countries. And also trends over time. So this arrow shows you whether a certain aspect of sustainability has consistently either improved, stagnated, or deteriorated over the past decade, so since 2010. Because especially for those sustainability indicators, we feel the long-term view is really, really important to look at trends and see warning signs early. So in Iceland, we see very clear strength on the right. If we look at social capital, everything is green. High trust in other people and in government, and comparatively good representation of women in national parliament. But then if we go to the left, natural capital, very clear warning signs. So bottom third for both greenhouse gas emissions per capita and material footprint, and both material footprint, so material consumption, and biodiversity, measured by the Red List Index of Threatened Species, have been deteriorating since 2010. I want to show you a few other trends for the OECD as a whole. So all the numbers here are now OECD averages. Obviously, there's a lot of country variation, but it's also very interesting to take this global picture. And this time we're asking the question, this is current data, so 2021, wherever possible. We're asking the question, how has well-being changed in the long term? So over the past decade, since 2010, this is shown on the right of the slide. And also compared to numbers just before the pandemic. So basically, have we recovered since the pandemic, and which well-being areas have done so? And we can see that actually for several areas of well-being, that indeed seems to be the case. So the indicators shown here, for example, household income, the employment rate, the gender wage gap, air pollution, aspects of safety, such as the homicide rate and the safety gender gap, have actually all improved, both since 2010 and also since just before the pandemic. But progress has been much less visible in other areas. So household wealth has only grown by 4% since 2010. If you compare that to household income on the previous slide, that has grown by 15%. And several other areas have barely moved, so we could really call this as stagnation. This refers to income inequality, housing affordability, life satisfaction, feelings of social connection or social support, and voter turnout. And the one area which is not surprising given what has happened in the pandemic, where the value today is actually lower than before the pandemic is life expectancy. When it comes to sustainability of well-being for OECD countries as a whole, there's also some clear warning signs in each of those dimensions. In terms of economic capital, both financial net worth of governments has deteriorated since 2010, and household debt has increased since the onset of COVID. For human capital, educational attainment and premature mortality have improved, so this looks good. But actually, really concerningly, the share of the labor force that is either unemployed, underemployed, or discouraged, so what we call the labor underutilization rate, has not recovered compared to pre-COVID-19 levels, and is actually today almost on par with its value from a decade ago. In terms of natural capital, we see deteriorations in material consumption similar to what we've seen for Iceland at the country level, and biodiversity, and not enough progress to meet global greenhouse gas reduction targets. So although greenhouse gas emissions are colored in green here because it has improved since 2019 and 2010, this improvement is not enough to actually make a difference to the globally agreed targets. And then social capital is also really interesting. We have seen improvements for the OECD as a whole in terms of trust in government, and trust in government actually bumped up during the pandemic. We've seen rises in trust in government there for many OECD countries. And today there's 32% of parliamentary seats held by women. This is an improvement compared to 2010 and 2019. Obviously, we can discuss, this is still very far away from equality at 50%. Nevertheless, an improvement over time. What is concerning here is trust in other people. And this is an area where we actually didn't have long-term data for a while. But having worked with National Statistical Office to include this, we now do have comparative data. And this has really stagnated. In 2021, this stagnated compared to 2018 and actually deteriorated over the long term. So some warning signs for social capital and social cohesion. I will end with some of the challenges we're still grappling with in terms of well-being monitoring. And the first is that, yes, so on the one hand, we do have to acknowledge that there really has been a lot of advances in including previously unthinkable aspects of well-being in official statistics. So, for example, we wrote technical guidelines on how to measure subjective well-being and on how to measure trust in 2013 and 2017. And questions that have been recommended in those guidelines have now been integrated into the annual EU Silk survey for European countries. So that we have annual data for those aspects is really amazing. And this finding that trust in others has deteriorated over the long term would not have been possible without that inclusion. But overall, both the frequency and the timeliness, so the lack with which those data are published, of well-being data collection more generally does remain an issue. For instance, time use surveys is what we usually use to draw on our indicators of work-life balance or social interactions with other people. And those are, not all OECD countries conduct them to begin with, and if so, more often only every 5 to 10 years. That is not enough to inform policy decisions that have to be done quickly and on a timely basis. We have actually seen during the pandemic that governments can and have conducted high-frequency surveys, often standalone surveys, or by adding well-being content to existing for example, quarterly labor force surveys that happened, for example, in New Zealand. And this way, we have seen actually better data collection on well-being during the pandemic because governments really needed it to, in real life, fuel their decision-making. But we have also seen this momentum already fade now. So, for example, in a recent report we conducted on measuring population mental health, we have found that since March 2020, so onset of COVID-19, 7 in 10 OECD countries did add mental health modules to existing surveys or launched new frequent mental health surveys, but most of those have been now discontinued, and a return to business as usual prior to the pandemic would mean that half of OECD countries only collect mental health data every 4 to 10 years. The second challenge is that well-being monitoring focuses on outcomes at the broader population level by design. This is really important to see if we are on the right track. as society as a whole, but it does not help you answer the question of how to improve those outcomes and what different government sectors can do about that. For this, we need to link the outcomes to policy processes and drivers and start mapping activities of different agencies against the well-being frameworks that we have. And then lastly, communicating the key messages of a broad and multidimensional dashboard of often many indicators can be a challenge, particularly to policymakers who are very busy and need quick and actionable insights. So we really need to think more about the communication and have that as an explicit strategy when monitoring well-being in a dashboard approach. I just have a few more concluding slides on that point in particular. So one of the first options that we see is that even if you do have a very large dashboard, the OECD has more than 80 indicators, some countries such as Italy have more than 100, is to select a smaller set of headline indicators for more concise communication of key trends. And maybe those can also be monitored and measured on a more frequent basis. And then you can use the rest of the bigger, larger dashboard for more and deeper analysis. We are seeing this trend in a number of OECD countries, so we are using this ourselves. We have 36 headlines, 12 for well-being averages, 12 for well-being inequalities, and 12 for resources for future well-being. And other countries such as Ireland, Canada, Italy, and Austria also using this approach. I will say that none of them have less than 12 headlines, so you can, there's also a debate of whether even that is too much for precise communication. But yeah, we definitely see opportunities here for knowledge exchange on how to best select headline indicators. Should this be a really fixed set? Should you maybe rotate them depending on policy priorities and actual trends in well-being? And how do you best integrate them with the rest of your dashboard? A second approach for communication is not to maybe focus on headline indicators per se, but on key messages that arise when analyzing your dashboard in accordance with specific themes. So in a recent report on well-being in Finland that we've done with the Ministry of Social Affairs and Health, we chose key messages on the state of well-being according to 3 predefined areas of people, economy, and planet, and then focused particularly on those where improvements in one area contrasted with decline in other areas. And this is how the themes themselves were shown, rather than going kind of automatically and robotically through your dashboard. So here in this approach, you do your deeper analysis first, which also takes some time, and then only communicate your key messages that are policy relevant. The people, Heli is here, so you can talk to her if you have any questions about the Finnish experience and how useful this was for them. And then lastly, this is my last slide, I cannot stress that we should really not underestimate the importance of good design and good data visualizations. And this cannot be an afterthought if the indicators are to be easily accessible and easily understandable. So I'm just showing a few examples here from national well-being initiatives in the Netherlands. Austria is down here. They're also showing trends over time, both long-term trends and short-term trends in one graphic. New Zealand and the UK, just to show what they have done with their dashboards. This means designers actually should be involved in your strategy from the very beginning, even maybe in how you're designing your dashboard and selecting your headline indicators. And again, this is an opportunity for peer exchange in terms of what is the best and effective communication, because that will be part of the impact. There's some further links. I'm sure you will get the slides afterwards. And with that, I thank you very much.